Almost all countries in the world have debt. The United States has more than $40 trillion in debt, the European Union around $13 trillion, and Japan nearly $9 trillion. Even countries like Saudi Arabia that earn from oil, or economically strong countries like Germany and China, are not debt-free. At this point, a very simple but valid question comes to mind. If everyone has debt, then who is on the other side of that debt? In fact, the issue is a bit more interesting than it seems. This is not just about money. It involves history, power, and the system itself. Because debt is not only a burden, it is also a fundamental part of how the modern world functions. Almost all wars, crises, and economic booms have been built on this debt system. And when you follow this chain, at some point you realize something. The world is not in debt to a specific group. To a large extent, it is in debt to itself. But this does not mean that everyone benefits equally. So how did we get to this point? For that, we need to go back a little. Long before credit cards and banking applications, the concept of government debt emerged from wars. In 1694, England was at war with France and was almost out of money. The king decided to borrow from merchants and promised to pay interest with future taxes. In order to manage this system, the Bank of England was established. This was a major turning point. Now the state could spend money it did not yet have. Those who lent money received an official promise from the government, and that promise could be bought and sold. This is how government bonds were created and the foundation of the modern financial system was established. Then France adopted it, the Netherlands improved it, and the United States used it to finance both its War of Independence and its later development. After a while, debt was no longer a sign of weakness, but a sign of strength. In other words, being able to borrow meant being trusted. Today, this system has become completely global. The total global debt is over $300 trillion and continues to grow. Nearly every 100 days, another $1 trillion is added. Every country has debt. Every bank lends. Every individual, through taxes and pension funds, is part of this system. So, everyone is both a debtor and a creditor. Now let's look at the United States. Almost half of its $38 trillion debt is held by investors. Most of these investors are Americans themselves: banks, funds, insurance companies, and even the central bank. The remaining portion is held by foreign countries: Japan, China, Korea, and others. So the statement, "the U.S. owes China," is true, but it represents only a small part of the total debt. In reality, most of the U.S. debt is held internally. The system works like this. The government issues bonds. Banks and funds buy them. The government collects taxes, pays interest, and that interest flows back into the same system. This is a closed loop. This situation is not unique to the United States. Japan lends to the U.S. lends to the European Union, Europe lends to developing countries, and those countries invest their money back into major economies' bonds. So the system looks like this. Everyone is holding someone else's debt. If we think about it a bit ironically, it's like everyone is sitting at the same table, borrowing from each other, but no one is saying, "Let's settle the debt." The most powerful part of this system is the markets. Which country can borrow cheaply and who has to pay higher interest depends on the markets. If markets lose trust in governments, currencies collapse, economies weaken, even governments can change. In other words, democracy chooses who governs, but markets decide who survives. Central banks also play a huge role here. They don't just manage debt, they also create money. For example, when a central bank buys bonds, it creates new money in return. Thus, one party's debt becomes another party's asset. In fact, every unit of money in circulation is connected to some form of debt. The concept of debt-free money almost does not exist. This system has worked for years because people trust it. Investors believe that governments will pay interest. As long as this trust continues, the system works and sustains itself. But if this trust is shaken, problems begin. We have seen this in Greece, Argentina, and Sri Lanka. When debt cannot be paid, crises emerge. Economies collapse and people suffer. But what is interesting is that the system still does not stop. New debts replace old ones, and the process starts again. Because in this system the goal is not to eliminate debt, the goal is to roll over the debt. In other words, governments do not plan to eliminate debt, they simply try to manage it. Now comes the most interesting part. What would happen if all debts were paid off one day? Most people think that would be good. But in reality, the opposite would happen. Markets would start collapsing. Money supply would shrink, the economy would weaken, because these debts are also the foundation of the system. That is why politicians saying, "we will pay off the debt," is an illusion. The real goal is not to eliminate debt, but to keep it sustainable. However, there is an imbalance here. Interest income is not distributed equally. It mostly goes to large investors, while ordinary people support the system through taxes. So, this system also increases the gap and inequality between the rich and the poor. In conclusion, there is no single villain in this system. Neither China nor the United States nor the IMF is solely responsible. The system is made up of all of us. In short, the world runs on debt. This debt circulates within itself, and everything depends on one thing: trust. As long as that trust remains, the system will continue. But if that trust is broken one day, everything could change.